So moving on to the illustrative indices and actions for priority area 2, which is adapt land use plans and protect critical public assets and services, which is very important, especially to make sure that adaptation and economic growth are inclusive and equitable. Action 2.1 under this, identify critical public services and assets. If you want to protect them and adapt the plans, you obviously have to have a good identified list. Here critical infrastructure and services are identified. Inventory of public assets and infrastructure is prepared, including hospitals, schools and university buildings. Buildings of all these things, their conditions, exposure to hazards and maintenance history. Often disasters happen because such monitoring is not done. Gaps in infrastructure and public assets identified. Investment plans to increase the resilience of public services and infrastructure systems is completed. These are the priority area action 2.1 in terms of identifying critical public services and assets. Action 2.2 under priority area 2, design and implement a government-wide strategy to increase the resilience of infrastructure and public assets. So strategy to manage critical assets and infrastructure is approved and published. Agency in charge of coordinating resilience of critical assets and infrastructure is created and operational. Asset management systems with evidence-based maintenance plans in place. Okay, evidence-based. Construction standards for infrastructure and buildings updated, accounting for local hazards and criticality, and enforcement mechanisms in place. Lots of regulations often and standards are set up, but enforcement is missing or governance is failing in enforcement, and there is of course corruption where people can pay off the enforcing agents and so on. So this is all very critical, because when disasters happen there's always a hunt for a scapegoat, but that doesn't prepare you for the future. Okay, continuing expected recovery time for critical infrastructure systems, especially power, transport, water, etc. after a major event are very critical. How the system is going to recover after a shock or a major event. Revised legal framework to allocate risks across stakeholders, including in PPP and buildings. Okay. SOEs have included climate change in their strategy and decision making. This is PPP, here is public-private partnership, as you remember. So action 2.3, revise land use and urban plans to make them risk informed. So risk maps are needed at high enough granularity in space and time, and they are made useful and usable by people and firms to have the revised land use and urban plans to be risk informed. Here, the percentage of country or municipality with revised land use or urbanization plans that include current and projected hazards have to be known. Share of population living or relocated from high-risk areas has to be known. Share of population living in fragile buildings or retrofitted fragile buildings has to be well documented. Strategy or specific regulations regarding the use of nature-based solutions approved. I have multiple podcasts related to nature-based solutions under drawdown and climate science, climate change, new findings in climate change and so on, which are very critical, but it shouldn't become something like ecosystem based management, which was coined for managing fisheries, but instead of just catching the top predators like salmon and tuna, we worry about the food web in which they live, so that you manage the whole food web or the ecosystem and not just take out the predators somewhere and perturb the entire ecosystem, as it's referred to as fishing down the food web or some such thing. Okay, so those are very critical as well in terms of considering nature-based solutions as real implementable solutions with well-documented benefits, like mangroves for improving habitats and fish and ecosystems, as well as providing protections against cyclones and waves, sea level rise, and so on. Okay, areas impossible or too costly to protect against climate change impacts identified and communicated to the public. So there is the residual risk that we talked about, but if there are areas that are just not going to be protected or impossibly costly to protect against climate change impacts, then people should be made aware that they are living in this area and that they are better off moving or not moving into such areas after the communication is done. So easier said than done, because moving people is not easy, especially if generations have been living there or their livelihood depends on living there, like fishermen at a coastline and so on. Regulation mandating provision of climate and hazard information to buyer in real estate market is tracked and informed as well. Okay, so that's priority area 2. We'll come back and look at priority area 3 on helping firms and people manage residual risks and natural disasters. Okay, so again, I say next, but that will go in the proper section, priority area 3. Okay.